Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti.
Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast and the continuation of our treatment of the many centers of Renaissance art in Italy. We've done quite a bit of work in the northern courts, and now I want us to turn our attention to central Italy and the town of Perugia, which is found in the region of Umbria. So those are some terms we're going to be using. Perugia, Umbria, central Italy is the idea. Perugia plays an important role in the shift from what we call the early Renaissance to the high Renaissance, for what terminology matters, and that's namely through the influence of one central master from Perugia known as Perugino. The first issue, however, is looking at Perugia itself as a center and understanding its important position in Italy. Perugia, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, stood at the crossroads of papal influence, local civic identity, and a cultural market shaped by itinerant workshops. It was within the dominion of the papal states. So this belongs to the Pope, and they have this swath of papal states that extend up into Urbino, but it is under the watch of a renowned family known as the Baglioni family. So in this context, Perugia's religious and civic institutions fostered demand for devotional imagery and altarpieces, creating a productive environment for masters like Perugino to establish what would be one of the most prolific workshops in central Italy. Perugino was Perugia's most prominent native painter and who trained many successors through his workshop network. Perugino's ties to what we call confraternities, church commissions in Perugia, and surrounding Umbria reflect what should be considered a broader pattern in central Italy, where urban centers leveraged religious patronage to mobilize their artistic labor, if that makes sense. They're elevating local artists and they're integrating, surprise, surprise, many Florentine stylistic approaches into their regional artistic programs. The city's political economy, characterized by powerful families and civic authorities navigating papal oversight, that economy helps sustain a market for large scale religious paintings, altarpieces, and programmatic decoration, fresco cycles, this sort of work. And it's often produced through collaborative workshop practices that linked Florence with Perugia and other central Italian centers like Urbino. Perugino's workshop served as a conduit for this diffusion of style, especially his compositional clarity and balanced space. We're going to talk about that, which later influenced Raphael and reinforced Perugia's role as a vital link in the Renaissance network. These dynamics are going to illustrate how Perugia functioned not merely as a backdrop, but as an active agent in shaping the style of Renaissance art and its social reach. So, yes, we're going to have to navigate Florentine stylistic influence, but also understand that artwork in Umbria responds to its own specific economic and political circumstances. So to navigate this, we're going to discuss Perugino's first, his Florentine period. And then we are going to bring it back to see what he's doing as a mature artist in Perugia itself. So Perugino. His name's Pietro di Cristoforo Vannucci, but he's known as Perugino, like a little guy from Perugia is all that means. He was a central figure moving between Florentine and Umbrian painting at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries. So he's born around 1446 in a town called Città della Pieve in Umbria, and he came out of the same environment that shaped the dominant Florentine styles, but he ended up developing his own distinctive visual approach. That is one that is marked by calm, clarity, and carefully ordered space is one way to put it. But this style helps lay the groundwork for what we think of as the High Renaissance. His career, which includes early success, a highly productive workshop, and major papal commissions in Rome, his career gives us a useful window into how reputation, patronage, and studio collaboration actually worked in central Italy during the Quattrocento. Perugino's rise took place within Florence's artistic culture, where he worked in the early part of his career, meaning around the 1470s. That means during the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent. So Perugino absorbed the visual language of the early Renaissance alongside figures like he's working alongside Botticelli, he's working alongside Ghirlandaio, he's actually learning and training inside of Verrocchio's workshop, which is where Leonardo da Vinci was training. So Perugino is part of this enormous dialogue of magnificent Florentine artists. And from the writings of Giorgio Vasari and onward, so middle of the 16th century and onward, Perugino is often described as both an important teacher and a model of compositional harmony, which are qualities that he is going to carry forward into the work of Raphael, who is his most famous pupil. So what we see here is a broader Renaissance pattern. The workshop as a hub for training and collaboration and the spread of a recognizable style across different regions, because he's going to train in Florence and bring that back to Perugia. Now, that Raphael connection is always going to be key. We're going to follow that through here because it's not Perugino's style itself that becomes the essence of the High Renaissance, but rather how Raphael adapts it to conform with major changes ushered in on the Florentine scene by Leonardo and Michelangelo. So I say that because very often it can be argued that Perugino is too harmonized, overly stiff, and very often, in my opinion, Perugino's works, they lack pathos, emotional depth, right? Yet Perugino's workshop model is key. He ran a large, well organized operation that connected Florence, Perugia, and other centers around Umbria. Like many successful painters of the period, he coordinated teams of assistants to handle commissions from churches, confraternities, elite patrons. But by reusing effective compositions and carefully managing the division of his labor, he was able to produce a high volume of work while maintaining consistent visual identity. But that also means sort of for lack of a better term, a lot of boring copies and reuses. So his workshop's often treated as a textbook example, though, of how collaborative production could support efficiency and, let's say, artistic coherence. So this ties into the ongoing challenges of attribution. So many of the works coming out of his workshop were collaborative. It can be difficult to determine what was executed by Perugino himself versus his assistants. Scholars continue to debate these distinctions, which in turn sheds light on how Renaissance workshops actually functioned, not as solitary studios, but as complex collective enterprises. So it's important that if you are commissioning a work from Perugino's workshop, that you should not be able to tell what his assistants did versus what he did, even though sometimes we can do that, especially with other workshop environments. It's just in Perugino's environment, it becomes so harmonized that it becomes more difficult to tell. It's part of the business aspect of Perugino's artistic style. So patronage, of course, plays a major role in all of this. We're in the Florentine period. Perugino worked for Lorenzo the Magnificent, and his involvement in the papal projects, especially in the Sistine Chapel under Pope Sixtus IV. We are not going to talk about Perugino's paintings in the Sistine Chapel this time, but we will talk about them soon. These were really important for his reputation, and they weren't just prestigious, they brought together artists and workshop practices from different regions, really all converging in the Sistine Chapel. Okay. Um, that creates this artistic crossroads in the 1480s. So, in that setting, Perugino's style and methods become part of a larger more, let's say, cosmopolitan visual language, which in the case of the Sistine Chapel, we can tie to Rome's ceremonial and religious needs. So tapping into these crossroads, we can look at Perugino's career economically, which reflects broader patterns within the Renaissance art market, where reputation mattered enormously. Early success could lead to better commissions, higher prices, more visibility, the growth of your workshop, and creating a kind of feedback loop. Artists weren't operating in isolation. That's the point. They were navigating a competitive market shaped by demand, patronage networks, and evolving taste, and Perugino's strong early reputation likely played a key role in sustaining his long and productive career. So let's look at some of his artworks. I want to start with an earlier work that he completed in Florence. Actually, it's the shining emblem of his Florentine period, his 1470s Adoration of the Magi, which is now in the National Gallery of Umbria in Perugia. I have to say, I have a very hot and cold relationship with Perugino. Um, but seeing this work when I went to study this in Perugia was really a treat. And but that just continues to reinforce my well-known by now Florentine bias because there is very little in his adoration that looks like what we know to be a textbook Perugino. So this is an important part of the story. The painting was commissioned for the Church of Santa Maria dei Servi in Perugia, which makes it a painting by a Perugian in a Florentine style for a Perugian church. And he's doing this while in Florence. So, what do we have? Have a look. The Adoration of the Magi by Perugino. The Madonna and Child are to the right. The Magi and the other adorers are to the left, dressed fashionably and dressed in a courtly manner. Perugino himself looks out at us from among the crowd, so you can see him. There's truly complicated and technically exciting use of space here. Look, you have a standard perspectival system with a vanishing point, diagonal lines that lead you to this vertical tree, which forces your eye to return to the Magi, yet the kneeling Magi are closer to us, the viewer, in the foreground than the Madonna is. And so this creates a subtle diagonal axis that counters the orthogonal lines, that's the diagonal lines of the perspectival grid, is being countered by a different perspectival axis. It's really remarkable, the rendering of this kind of depth in space, because Perugino's predominant style in his later career is actually very flat. So what we have here is a work indebted to his Florentine training, but not one that will endure in his predominant style that answers to the needs of the Umbrian court. Indeed, another of his Florentine works that he did for Lorenzo the Magnificent himself is that of Apollo and Daphnis, not Daphne, Daphnis, with an unsure date somewhere between 1480 and 1490, when all of those magnificent mythological works were being produced by Botticelli and Signorelli and the Pollaiolo brothers and Piero di Cosimo and all of these painters in the Medici court doing mythological works. Perugino does Apollo and Daphnis in the Louvre now. The work exemplifies that influence of Lorenzo's culture, the revival of mythological painting, the overtness of the nude. And if you're looking at this work, pay close attention to Apollo's anatomy because it's going to come back in a minute. But it begins this work to look like what we understand to be Perugino. That is, the painting where the figures inhabit basically only the foreground, rather than the complex depth of the Magi painting with this diagonal axis that counters an orthogonal perspectival grid that creates this very dynamic space. This is not the case. You have two figures in the foreground and a very Flemish-inspired, Sicilian-inspired background, landscape background that becomes predominant in Florentine painting as well. So there's no pyramid composition. It's more of a flat frontal plane of a composition, which is typical for him. It is an interesting work. Perugino shows his remarkable ability to render a classical nude figure. Apollo, in this case, who's excellently modeled in chiaroscuro, the use of light and shade on his body to create depth and modeling. Apollo is watching a pastoral character, probably Daphnis, who is playing a pipe. Daphnis was one of Apollo's lovers. Daphnis is also the male embodiment of the laurel for which Lorenzo gets his name from. So sometimes his work is titled Apollo and Marsyas, that being the famed musical competition between them. But Marsyas is a satyr, and this is the Louvre actually has recently retitled this work more accurately to be Apollo and Daphnis. You've probably heard of Apollo and Daphne, like I said, which is a different story. That's the female embodiment of the laurel, and she becomes the laurel tree when she's trying to escape Apollo and calls on her father, who transforms her into the laurel tree. Daphnis is the male equivalent in another one of Apollo's lovers. So we're not shying away from that element of this story here with Perugino's work for Lorenzo. So this is a win after this period that Perugino, with other Florentine artists, end up in Rome, 1481, to work in the Sistine Chapel. That is Cosimo Roselli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, Botticelli. Perugino completed a few paintings in the Sistine Chapel in the time of Pope Sixtus IV, those 1480s, including his most famous work, Christ giving the keys to St. Peter. But we are going to tackle this series of paintings in another podcast. So for your Perugino curiosity, sure, have a look at Christ giving the keys to St. Peter, but we're going to look at that whole commission in the future.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, do you want more content and maybe to help support this show? Join me on Patreon for exclusive podcast episodes, or if you want a visual experience, you can enroll in my Udemy course, which teaches the Florentine Renaissance and includes nearly 12 hours of art history lectures. You can also find podcast merch on our Etsy. You'll find links to all of these in the show notes. I want to thank you all sincerely for listening. Now, back to the show. So, Florence and Rome, and now we're establishing a workshop in Perugia itself. So we see Perugino as adaptable to his environment and circumstances, but it is in Perugia where he establishes his most formal workshop, that a truly Umbrian Renaissance style emerges via his leadership. Should we look at the last work I want to talk about today, the Dicemviri altarpiece, which was executed in Perugia, finished in 1495, 1496. Okay, so this was commissioned by the titular Dicemviri, or Dicemviri, if you want to pronounce the V. It's a Latin word for the 10 Dicem Viri men. So the Dicemviri, the 10 men who were part of the governing body of Perugia, and so commissioned this painting for the government palace, the Palazzo dei Priori, the palace of the Lord Priors. It's a beautiful medieval building right in the center of Perugia that houses the National Gallery of Umbria today, which is well worth a visit. This work, though, is no longer in Palazzo dei Priori, but is instead in the collection of the Vatican after it was kidnapped by Napoleon and then eventually returned by the artist, the neoclassical artist, Antonio Canova. It's signed by Perugino via the Latin inscription on the throne of the Virgin and Child, which means there is not an attribution problem with this work. It is a very much confirmed Perugino painting. So let's look at it. We have a Madonna and Child enthroned, classic, on a highly classicized throne. That is, looking at the influence of Greco-Roman revival. You get Roman carved reliefs and a Greek geometric plan running around the base of the throne. And this is what is called a sacra conversazione, a holy conversation. That is a Madonna enthroned among saints. These are the four most important saints of Perugian worship. That is Saint Louis of Toulouse, Saint Ercolanus, Saint Costanzo, who is the patron saint of Perugia himself, and the first bishop of Perugia. And last but not least, and most importantly, is St. Lawrence, who is the titular saint of the cathedral in Perugia, is San Lorenzo. So we have extremely important saints to the civic qualities of Perugia being commissioned by government officials for the government palace chapel at the high altar. So this altarpiece, the Decemviri altarpiece, is quite standard Perugino, which is frankly where a lot of us, let's say, depart. I don't want to disparage Perugino's influence or his importance. However, there is just stylistic reasons to not, I don't want to ruffle any feathers. You see, it's a very successful work on the design element with superb architectural rendering, accurate space, a very vibrant color system, which was permitted by the medium of oil paint. However, if I were to generally define Perugino's work, I could confidently call it a bit stiff and lacking, really lacking in emotional depth. The harmony, the compositional harmony that Perugino achieves in these works is often somewhat too much. It's too rigid, it's too rigorous, and sometimes it gives the workshop copy and paste feeling with his saints, meaning are these really original compositions or is this a saint that's been done 100 times out of a workshop book? There's not a whole lot to it in those terms. Because even though the perspective is exceptional, it still feels flat. How do you manage such a thing? Figures are usually very close in his works. They share a single plane like Apollo and Daphnis, and everyone looks somewhat bored or uninterested. We might more politely say that they are neutral or passive, but this is a far cry, Renaissance people, from the more emotionally heavy works that were being produced in this period, the kind of work that Perugino himself did in Florence, but did not continue in his workshop operations in Perugia, but rather developed this kind of style that became both so wholly Perugino's, but also indicative of the state of the market in central Italy. So it's a rectangular altarpiece, but it had a format that would be a little bit unusual for what we're used to talking about. It was designed with what is known as a cimasa. That is an additional piece of art that goes at the top of an altarpiece. In Italian, the top of something is called the cima. So this is a cimasa. It's a much smaller work, but it's also square, which then creates this rectangle upon, or this square upon a rectangle appearance on the high altar of a palace chapel, which is very interesting because usually it gets rounded at the top, which symbolizes the heavens, what have you. And initially, this Cimasa, Perugino was away from Perugia when another artist was asked to complete the Cimasa for the altarpiece. However, when Perugino returned, he claimed his contract, said no, this was my commission, and he completed another Cimasa, the one that is now in the National Gallery of Perugia. The altarpiece is in the Vatican Pinacoteca. So Perugia completes both parts. They are all from Perugino's hand. The subject of the Cimasa is a man of sorrow. That is Christ shown in all of his suffering, showing you his wounds, showing you his emaciated body, standing sort of at the crux of the tomb. The modeling of the body, I told you to have a look at that Apollo before, is actually remarkably similar to the nude. So that nude Apollo that he does. So we know that the work that Perugino did for Lorenzo the Magnificent, we see it, the influence of it, the impact of it reappear in this religious work that he's doing for the Perugian government. I selected this, the Decemviri altarpiece, not only to demonstrate what Perugian patronage looked like, but also because the style of the work is so textbook Perugino that it can give you an idea of what are rather consistent stylistic choices that make him easy to identify for the most part, other than with those early works, the workshop works, or works where Raphael is painting remarkably similar. So there's an exception to that. Ultimately, I do feel the need to repeat this as I conclude here. Perugino's style is absolutely central in understanding the development of the High Renaissance style because Raphael learns it as a Central Italian painter in Perugino's circle. But then Raphael goes to Florence, picks up on these major innovations of emotion, of depth, of clarity, of drama by Leonardo and Michelangelo, and merges it with the Perugian style, which becomes the stylistic school of Raphael and his followers in the High Renaissance, which has no small impact on the future of Western painting. Renaissance people, thank you for tuning in. I hope you leave this conversation with a clearer understanding of the impact of Perugino and the centrality of Perugia in the transition from the Quattrocento to the Cinquecento. This exchange between the northern courts and central Italy will have an enormous impact on the development of the Renaissance as we see it in Rome, which we are working towards one podcast at a time. Until next time, arrivederci.